If you've picked Arcane Mage but have no idea what's going on, how Arcane Charges work, when to barrage, or what your cooldowns are actually doing, this guide is going to fix that. So let's start with the basics. At its core, Arcane Mage is about generating Arcane Charges and spending them as efficiently as possible. You build up with 4 Arcane Charges, then spend them with Arcane Barrage, your main spender and biggest damage tool. You have a simple but deep loop. 1. Generate Arcane Charges using these abilities. 2. Spend those charges using Arcane Barrage. 3. Repeat while layering in cooldowns and reacting to procs. Each ability that generates charges has its own purpose. Arcane Missiles is reactive. It procs from our passive Clearcasting. This will be indicated by those 2 symbols around your character, and it means you can cast Arcane Missiles for free. Arcane Orb is a great tool for Arcane Charges generation. You can store up to 2 orbs. When used, it'll give you an Arcane Charge on the initial cast, and more when it hits targets. And Arcane Blast, it's your core filler. You would use it if you cannot use Orb or missiles. So when do you spend? You almost always spend at 4 Arcane Charges using Arcane Barrage. It resets your charges, deals huge damage, and often activates passive effects. And that's basically the entire spec. You build charges, you spend charges. Now that we understand how the core idea works, we can layer cooldowns on top of it. On top of your loop, Arcane Mage is built around cooldowns. You have 3 major ones. Evocation gives you mana, but mostly used because of Siphon Storm, a big intellect buff. Arcane Surge burns all your mana for damage and gives you a big damage amp. And Touch of the Magi applies a 12-second debuff that stores 25% of your damage and explodes when the timer expires. These line up into 2 phases. Your burn phase every 90 seconds, Evocation plus Arcane Surge plus Touch of the Magi, and your mini burn phase every 45 seconds with just Touch of the Magi. Because Touch of the Magi gives you 4 Arcane Charges, always try to spend 1 Arcane Barrage before you send Touch of the Magi, just so you wouldn't waste those Arcane Charges. Now, you might be asking yourselves, if Evocation brings me back my mana, do I need to manage that as well? In Mythic Plus, no. If you follow the spec's priorities, you'll almost never run out of mana. Even if you dip low during your opener, especially with Bloodlust, your tools stabilize it fast, and if you somehow go out of mana, Arcane Barrage still works at 0 charges. Mana is technically part of your gameplay, but once you know your flow, it won't bother you. Alright, so these were the basics. Now we'll add your hero talents to the mix. Spellslinger turns Arcane into a faster, more reactive spec. You still follow the same rhythm, but now you just add the Hellstorm weapon from Halo to your hero talent tree. You will now be able to generate Arcane Splinters, and whenever you get to 8 Splinters, your target will explode for extra damage. Now, while the passive damage is nice, the main reason you care about those splinters is because of the passive Spellfrost Teachings. This passive gives Arcane Splinters a chance to spawn an Arcane Orb, which is a very valuable Arcane Charge generator, especially in AoE. Now, how exactly are we generating those splinters? If you remember, we have our passive Clearcasting. Every time we spend our Clearcasting, usually with missiles, we activate our talent, Nether Precision, which will generate 2 splinters. Through the passive Splintering Orbs, our Arcane Orbs will conjure 2 additional splinters. And finally, through our biggest cooldown, Arcane Surge, that not only generates 8 splinters on its own, but also doubles the splinters generation. Here's a few key procs that you will probably have to track. First one is Intuition. It randomly supercharges your next barrage. Whenever you see it proc, press barrage regardless of how many charges you have. Arcane Tempo. Every time you use Arcane Barrage, it gives you a haste buff. Don't let this buff fall off. Arcane Harmony. Each time Arcane Missiles hits an enemy, the damage of your next Arcane Barrage is increased by 5%. And this effect stacks up to 20 times. And Orb Barrage. Casting Barrage can trigger a free Arcane Orb, which means more Arcane Charges. This spec rewards you for knowing what's coming and playing slightly ahead of the spec. not reacting after the fact. Arcane Mage's single target gameplay is in the fixed rotation. As we already said, your entire thing revolves around building up to 4 charges and then spending them with Arcane Barrage, ideally when it's empowered by those other effects. To help judge that, there's a WeakAura by Porom, the author of the Wowhead Arcane Mage Guide, that gives real-time visual and audio cues when it's actually optimal to use Arcane Barrage. It doesn't replace your understanding of Arcane Mage, but once you know the basics, it'll help you make better decisions on the fly. If you don't know how to play properly yet, it won't do the work for you, but it's a huge help when you're tracking multiple procs under pressure. Alright, so now let's go over the single target priority from highest to lowest. Alright, so your first priority is always use Arcane Barrage if you get intuition or if Arcane Tempo is about to fall off, even if you're knotted for Arcane Charges. Our second priority is to use Shifting Power to reduce the cooldowns of Arcane Surge and everything else. And you would want to do that after you've used Arcane Surge and when the Siphon Storm buff from Evocation expires. Our next priority is to use Arcane Barrage at 4 Arcane Charges if you have at least 12 stacks of Arcane Harmony and if you have 1 or less Nether Precision stacks. Then you would prioritize using Arcane Missiles with the Aether Attunement buff if Touch of the Magi is about to be available. If we don't have the Aether Attunement buff, and we got a Clearcasting proc, then we would still use Arcane Missiles if we don't have a Nether Precision stack. A side note, because we're running with the High Voltage talent, Arcane Missiles will have a chance to generate an Arcane Charge. So whenever you use Arcane Missiles in this build, be at less than 4 Arcane Charges to not overcap. The next priority is going to be a little confusing and you'll understand why I recommend that WeakAura from before, because her next priority is to use Arcane Barrage with 4 Arcane Charges if you have a Clearcasting proc, and if you have 1 stack of Nether Precision and either Aether Attunement or your target is below 35% health. Then the next priority is to use Arcane Barrage again if you have 4 Arcane Charges and if you have an Arcane Orb available. Then the next priority is to use that Arcane Orb if you're below 3 charges. Remember, you need to aim your character towards the enemy to hit with that Arcane Orb. Targeting isn't enough. Then the next priority is to use Arcane Barrage when you get an Intuition proc, so it's like the first priority but without the Arcane Tempo buff. Otherwise, if you're low on Arcane Charges and you don't have any Arcane Orbs available or anything procced, you would use your filler spells to generate charges. Arcane Explosion if you have less than 2 charges and you're in melee range, and Arcane Blast if you're in ranged, which is usually the case. The reason we prioritize Arcane Explosion below 2 charges is because it's instant and Arcane Blast does very low damage when you're low on Arcane Charges. The downside is you have to be in melee range to actually get the charges, so a lot of the time if you can't or shouldn't be in melee, just Arcane Blast. And just as a last resort, if you're somehow out of mana and Evocation is not available to regenerate your mana, you probably screwed something up and the only option you have left is to use Arcane Barrage without all the conditions we talked about. See, that's a lot of steps you have to remember and prioritize accordingly, so I truly recommend you get that WeakAura to help you out with that. Right, so now that we are over with the single target priority, let's move to AoE. Arcane Mage's AoE is nearly identical to single target priority. You're still managing the same Arcane Charges, reacting to procs, and syncing your cooldowns. But there's a few key differences that change how fast you cycle through your loop. First thing is Arcane Orb gives more charges. As we already said, in AoE, Arcane Orb becomes much more efficient. You gain 1 charge on a cast and then 1 charge per target hit. So against 3 targets, casting Orb will give you 4 Arcane Charges instantly, no setup required. The second difference is Aether Attunement Missiles Cleave. If you have Aether Attunement active, Arcane Missiles will hit your main target for 100% extra damage and cleave up to 4 additional enemies for 50% extra damage. This ramps up your Arcane Harmony stacks much faster. And the third difference in AoE, Magi's Spark requires all 3 spells. Whenever you use Touch of the Magi, make sure to include Arcane Blast, Arcane Barrage, and Arcane Missiles. That's because of Magi's Spark, a talent that causes all 3 spells to echo for 100% of their damage when all 3 land during touch. The spark explodes for massive AoE burst. So even in AoE, Don't skip Arcane Blast during your cooldown window. It's part of the combo. Spellslinger Arcane Mage is about learning the flow. Stay active. The spec rewards constant casting. Know your procs, intuition, Clearcasting, nether precision, Arcane Harmony, and Aether attunement all influence when and why you cast a certain spell. And if you're overwhelmed by tracking all of this mid-fight, use Porom's WeakAura. It doesn't replace your understanding, but once you've got the fundamentals down, it's one of the best tools for helping you judge when it's actually time to send a barrage. Arcane has a high ceiling, but the path up is straightforward. Build charges, play smarter on your procs, and don't let your buttons sit idle. If this guide helped you out, hit like and subscribe to get more WoW guides like this one, and leave a comment with any questions you might have. As always, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.